Section 10 of Richelieu by Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 4, The Aristocracy, Part 3. Gaston also left his native country after publishing a violent manifesto against the cardinal. A few days only after the death of Marillac, he entered Burgundy at the head of a small army, crossed France, and effected a junction with the governor of Languedoc, the Duc de Montmorency, whom he had by dint of persuasion brought over to his side. The royal forces commanded by Marshal Schomberg met the rebels under the walls of Castelnaudary, September 1682, and defeated them without much difficulty. Gaston fled at the first onset, throwing away his arms and saying that he would not engage any more in that sort of pastime. Montmorency, thus abandoned, was taken, tried, and put to death, notwithstanding the petitions of the whole nobility. The Duke of Lorraine had to pay dearly for the consequences of this fresh attempt at rebellion. Louis XIII. took Bar-le-Duc and quartered troops in Lorraine, 1634, which remained occupied by France till the end of the century. As for Gaston, being of the royal blood of France, which must be respected, he once more escaped, but was ordered to take up his residence at Blois. The birth of Louis XIV, 4 years later, September 15th, 1638, deprived him of the title and hopes of heir presumptive to the crown. Chancellor Chateauneuf, whose power dated only from the Journée des Dupes, was shut up as a prisoner at the castle of Angoulême, and his nephew Louville at the Bastille. The Chevalier de Jars, condemned to death, received his pardon whilst he was actually on the scaffold, and the Duchesse de Chevreuse was once more sent into exile. The panic had become so great that Marshal d'Estrees, who commanded an army in Germany, having seen a letter directed to one of his lieutenants, fancied he was about to meet with the same fate as Marillac. He abandoned his soldiers and obtained his pardon for so doing only by the comical account he gave to the king and cardinal of the terror which had seized hold of him. Louis XIII. Had always been of a reserved, timid, and melancholy disposition. His nature formed the most perfect contrast imaginable to that of the Vert Galant, his father. The very idea of irregularity in conduct was most repugnant to him, and he would not have deigned even to cast his eyes for a moment upon the fascinating but questionable beauties who formed the court of his mother and of his wife. Amongst these retainers of the court he soon distinguished, however, a young lady whose modesty and beauty combined had already created quite a sensation in the fashionable world, and who was so gentle, so quiet, so retired in her manners, that she seemed more fitted for the cloister than for the gaieties of the Louvre. That lady was Marie de Hautefort, youngest child of the Marquis Charles de Hautefort, Marechal des Camps et Armées of the king, and gentleman in ordinary of the royal bedchamber. Marie was left an orphan at a very tender age, and without much fortune, under the care of her grandmother, Madame de la Flotte-Hauterive. Her early years were spent amidst the dullness of a country town. She heard a good deal about the court and its pleasures, and with all the eagerness of a child she longed to know something about that Louvre and that Saint-Germain, which she had learned to consider as a kind of fairyland. Sincerely pious, she tells us at the same time that when she was only 11 or 12 years of age, she used to retire to her room for the purpose of praying God fervently that he might make her go to court. Her request was answered. Called on business to Paris, Madame de la Flotte-Hauterive took with her Marie de Hautefort, who, as soon as she arrived, became a centre of attraction. She won specially the affection of a lady celebrated by her beauty, her wit, and unfortunately by the scandal of her life, Louise Marguerite de Guise, daughter of the Balafre, Princesse de Conti, the acknowledged mistress of Marshal Bassompierre. All the fashionables of the metropolis were anxious to know who that young girl was sitting in the carriage of the Princesse de Conti, as that lady drove to the Abbey of Longchamp, or through the glades of the forest of Saint-Germain. She was only 12 years old when the Queen Mother, Marie de Medici, chose her to be one of her maids of honour, and she soon displayed in her new and difficult position qualities which secured to her the affection of all those into whose company she was thrown, just as much as her graces had called forth their admiration. She combined firmness of character with the greatest and most discriminating generosity. Her piety was equalled by her wit, and the dignity of her deportment borrowed additional charms from her modesty and her reserve. During the course of the year 1630 she followed the Queen Dowager to Lyons, where the king had fallen seriously ill, whilst Richelieu was at the head of the troops in Italy. Louis XIII. Had not yet met Mademoiselle de Hautefort. It was at Lyons that he saw her for the first time, and he soon conceived for her an attachment of the most romantic nature. He could not bear her being out of his sight, so much so that when, after the Journée des Dupes, and in consequence of it, Marie de Medici was exiled, he removed Mademoiselle Hautefort from her service and placed her in the household of Anne of Austria, conferring at the same time upon Madame de la Flotte-Hauterive a position at court in the stead of Madame de Fargy. Mademoiselle de Hautefort's position at court was one of extreme delicacy, and attended even with considerable danger. She had become sincerely attached to the Queen, Anne of Austria, and the feeling she entertained for her was the cause of endless disputes between herself and Louis XIII. The king had no affection whatever for his wife. In the first place, he knew that she was the cardinal's bitter enemy, and although he himself often resented Richelieu's haughty ways, his absolute disposition, and his passion for command, yet he uniformly supported him, being quite conscious that his system of policy was dictated by zeal for the good of the state. The affair of Chalais was another cause of estrangement, and a more personal one, between Louis XIII. And his queen. Thoroughly convinced that Marie de Medici shared the political opinions of Gaston, Duc d'Orléans, and helped him in all his plots against the government, he believed besides, as we have stated above, that she would have gladly married him had circumstances allowed her to do so, and that she secretly hoped for the death of a king who seemed a confirmed valetudinarian. Influenced by these various motives, Louis XIII. Did his best to detach Mademoiselle de Hautefort from her affections for a mistress whom he painted in the most unfavourable colours, and he would not or could not see that the greater the efforts he made in this direction, the more determined the demoiselle d'honneur was in her resolution not to desert an unfortunate and persecuted queen. Then, in addition to the assiduities of Louis XIII., the young girl had to contend with the cardinal's ill will. He had been delighted in the first instance by the king's affection for a child who belonged to no political party, and whose character he had not been able to penetrate. He hoped that such an influence would have the double result, first, of subduing the wayward, fantastic, and morose temper of Louis XIII., and of procuring to him, Richelieu, an ally who would disclose to him all the secrets of the court and act as a spy on the queen. He accordingly professed the greatest interest in Mademoiselle de Hautefort, loaded her with compliments and other marks of favour, thus rendering jealous all the ambitious ladies whom one single glance from Richelieu would have made happy for ever. It was dangerous trifling with so powerful a man as the cardinal. Yet our heroine did not hesitate to do so, and she, who had resisted the insinuations made by Louis XIII. Against the queen, would not condescend to act as the tool of the prime minister. Let us add that she knew absolutely nothing about the complicated politics of the day, the difficulties of the 30 Years' War, the rival interests of France and of Spain, the relations of the French government with England and Lorraine, were things she could not understand. All her knowledge amounted to this: the queen was persecuted and ill-used by her husband without having given him the slightest excuse for doing so. She was oppressed by Richelieu and held as a kind of prisoner in her own palace, when she was not an exile and an outcast. Under these circumstances it was perfectly natural that she should defend herself with every available weapon, and if the assistance of her brother, the King of Spain, could be procured, surely she, of all persons, had a decided and absolute right to it. Let us now turn for a few minutes to the consideration of another lady who played an important part in the history of that eventful time. Louise Angélique de Lafayette belonged to one of the first families in France, was pushed at court by the influence of a cabal, who, seeing Mademoiselle de Hautefort in disgrace, and feeling sure that Louis XIII. Must be under the spell of some favourite, took the opportunity of advancing the interests of their relative and protégé. Laporte tells us in his memoirs that during that time a cabal was organised by the Bishop of Limoges, uncle of Mademoiselle de Lafayette, Monsieur de Saint-Simon, Madame de Sénécé, and Mesdemoiselles d'Esch, de Vieux-Pont, and de Polignac, with the view of introducing Mademoiselle de Lafayette to court instead of Mademoiselle de Hautefort. His Eminence entered so thoroughly into this plan that in a short time the king no longer spoke to Mademoiselle de Hautefort, whereas his great diversion when in the queen's apartments was to entertain Mademoiselle de Lafayette and make her sing. The new favourite was of a disposition totally different from that of her predecessor, and although she was not more attractive, she was more tender, more gentle. Louis XIII. In the first instance honoured her with his attentions, chiefly to annoy Mademoiselle de Hautefort, but gradually he was completely fascinated, and ended by loving her seriously. Mademoiselle de Lafayette, in her turn, could not but be flattered with the notice of Louis XIII. Then, when he opened his heart to her and revealed his sadness, his melancholy, his suspicions, his distrust of everybody, when she saw the most powerful monarch in Europe more wretched than the least of his subjects, she could not help showing to him all the proofs of affectionate compassion. She mitigated his pains by expressing her readiness to share them. Finding himself on terms of deep friendship for the first time in his life with a lady of unblemished character and of a superior mind, the king manifested all his real qualities, his unflinching honesty, his talents, his spirit, the uprightness of his intentions, and he enjoyed at last the sweetness of mutual affection. There is no doubt that Mademoiselle de Lafayette loved Louis XIII. Madame de Motteville, who was her intimate friend, positively says so. But the sentiment she entertained for him was that of a sister, pure, disinterested, and springing from the highest motives. She did her very best to persuade him that his sincere reconciliation with the queen was a matter of conscience, and that he ought to shake off the heavy yoke laid upon him by Richelieu. It is curious to see two young girls thus openly setting at defiance a man such as the all-powerful cardinal. In vain he tried to win over Mademoiselle de Lafayette to his interests. He was unsuccessful here again, and thus baffled he had recourse to his accustomed stratagems. He inspired scruples into the mind both of the lady and the monarch, and so far destroyed their intimacy that Mademoiselle de La Fayette, who had often thought of taking the veil, retired definitively to the convent of the Ladies of St. Mary in the Faubourg Saint Antoine. M. Victor Cousin, from whom we have borrowed most of the above details, calls her a Mademoiselle de la Vallière qui n'a pas failli. She is certainly one of the most attractive characters in an age when there was both so much to admire and so much to condemn. End of Section 10.